Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And as we dive into yet another weekend perspective, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I want to dive into, understanding sort of private cloud and what are the opportunities or things that might limit private cloud AI? What are the opportunities for private cloud AI? And what are the things that maybe we aren't talking about as much, but probably should be, more relevant in the conversation as we talk about AI, as a whole. So, as we really kind of dig into it, I think, as I mentioned at the top of the show, so much of the narrative, so much of the conversation that we're seeing day in and day out is around what's going on in the public cloud. And some of that is obviously justified. We're seeing, huge amount of sales, huge revenue numbers, huge stock price of companies like NVIDIA. NVIDIA, so often is talking about, who they sell their chips to. We're seeing, huge investments and numbers thrown around by the cloud providers in terms of how much they're buying. So we hear, Meta's buying 600,000 GPUs and, hundreds of thousands of GPUs within the public cloud. We've talked to a number of, the private sort of, not private, but like smaller independent GPU clouds, the ones that previously have been doing a lot with crypto that have now shifted over to, focusing on GPU clouds for AI and generative AI. They're talking about, hey, they're backlogged for a year, 2 years, things like that. But I think the thing that we're not really talking about a lot, and we don't see in contrast because we're fascinated by sort of winners and losers and big numbers as opposed to sometimes use cases and realities, is some of the challenges that enterprises are facing with generative AI. Because while there are great demonstrations of things, DALL-E and Sora and ChatGPT and so forth, turning those into viable business applications as opposed to interesting assistants or things that are helping to create video or whatever they might be, there's still a gap there. There's still a large space between is this relevant to consumer types of use cases or things that could become businesses that are relevant to consumers, versus things that would be relevant to more enterprise types of things, whether it's, again, banking, insurance, manufacturing, automotive, all those types of things, right? And I think, the conversation we really haven't been having a whole lot. And again, it's the narrative that you see in the media tends to be, we love the huge personalities. We love the Jensen Huangs. We love the Sam Altmans, the sort of big personalities that are supposed to be sort of the thought leaders and the people that are shaping the industry. And we also love, from a media narrative perspective, sort of winners and losers, right? We love when somebody announces big earnings. We love when companies fail and they go bankrupt because that's sort of a definitive loser. But we don't really see a lot of conversation happening around just concerns around the realities that things, especially in the enterprise, don't tend to take off as fast as they do in the consumer space, because the barrier to entry, whether it's cost, whether it's learning curve, whether it's managed against other risks that the business is taking on, other priorities that the business has at the time. And so I thought I'd kind of dive into some of those and talk a little bit about why some of those concerns will probably lend themselves towards a conversation that we'll either have second half of this year into 2025, really about kind of private cloud AI, and sort of goes something like this, right? Most companies, if we talk about larger companies, and this is where things get sort of interesting, because there's data out there, or there's statements out there, not so much data, but statements out there, a lot of times from the cloud providers who say, well, the majority of data is kept in the cloud. The majority of customer, company data is kept in the cloud. And I think this is where you get into some nuance, right? Where, yes, there is tons of data in the cloud. There is, tons of YouTube videos, tons of Instagram pictures, tons of, data from our phones. And again, could be pictures, could be videos. I know, just from my daughters, their phones are probably 99% full of just pictures of them and their friends and so forth. But saying most of the data is in the cloud isn't necessarily correct if you put it in the context of, where do most enterprises keep their data? And most enterprises keep their data on premises, right? It is not just their data, it is their crown jewels, it's their intellectual property, it is their customer data, it is all sorts of things like that. So while, yes, there is a lot of data in the cloud, from a larger business perspective, that's not necessarily the case, right? So, if we start from that premises that most large companies keep their data on premises, And as we start to get into, training AI models, tuning AI models, those types of things, you're going to typically want to do that, fairly close to where, you want to keep your models and your data somewhat close. Now, this is where we start to get into some interesting dynamics, in that obviously, if you looked at the propensity of where GPUs are, yes, they are primarily in the public cloud. So now you have this sort of disparity issue of most of your data is on premises, sort of locked away, kept away from public view, or intermixing with public LLMs, but the vast majority of GPUs are in the cloud. And so we're going to get into some interesting scenarios in which companies are going to have to figure out, where how do I mix and match where my data is versus where my model is. Are we going to see people move data into sort of private, secluded, walled off environments in the public cloud to get access to GPUs? So if they do their own training of models, versus some sort of scenario in which they do some sort of augmentation of their model. So something like RAG, right? Retrieval augmented generation. So that's one of the first issues that kind of has to get resolved is where does data reside versus where do GPUs reside? And again, this could become one of the big issues in terms of obviously NVIDIA has huge market share, lots and lots of developers that have to do things with GPUs, again, whether this is gaming or crypto or other types of things, know how to use the software stack that's around NVIDIA. And, data scientists have been trained on this for a while. But does this become a way in which, as companies like Intel and AMD start to look for market share in the GPU space that right now NVIDIA has a huge moat for, does the enterprise, does on-prem, where customers have huge ongoing relationships with AMD and Intel, having bought servers from them, whether it was directly from them or through a Dell or HP or Cisco or Supermicro, does this offer an opportunity for them to find initial market share? A, because NVIDIA GPUs are very, very hard to find, but B, there may be opportunities for them to work through some pricing issues or other types of things at different scale that open up some opportunities for Intel and Dell, or Intel and AMD. That's a possibility. I think the next thing is, as we're seeing more and more generative AI models, so large language models, for example, there's going to be far less kind of large scale training of models than we saw in the past. We're seeing that those costs, those burdens being taken on, especially for initial consumer uses by the Metas, the Facebooks, the OpenAIs, the Googles of the world, the Amazons of the world. But from an enterprise perspective, they start to get into some different dynamics. If they are able to take a baseline model, whether it's Meta's model or Mistral's model or the IBM Granite models or Databricks' model, whichever sort of starting point they have, which are kind of targeting more enterprise starting points, right? There's lots of information there, and they then have to fine tune them. They may not need nearly as many GPUs as you would to build the model from scratch, right? The $100 million model, the $200-300 million model. You may be just looking at a rack of GPUs, right, that you can run for a month or something along those lines to train, specifically to fine tune for your use case, right? So we may see that become a thing. Then we start to really get into the data concerns that enterprises have, right? If you talk to most enterprises, right now, as excited as they will be around AI use cases, and many of them are exploring this, whether it's co-pilot types of things, trying to help developers, lots of things targeting things like call centers and kind of assistance and so forth. But so many of them look at those as going, okay, well, if I interact with those, the thing that I'm really kind of exposing to the business is really kind of my documentation, right? Like, how do I go about solving an HR problem? How do I go about resolving a common call center type of thing? But they're not necessarily exposing critical needs to be secure data, and so they have huge concerns over allowing the things from their business, whether they are expertise in their business or kind of internal data from their business, to be mixed with these LLMs, because they don't have enough experience with them. There's not enough kind of anecdotal data out there in the world to figure out, like, how exactly does it work? What does it do when it ingests my data? What does it do when it ingests my prompt engineering? And how much of that, if done properly, could sort of be leaked, if you will, or kind of re-engineered by somebody else going, I'm going to try and figure out what JP Morgan or Ford or Delta or somebody else is doing with large language models. Let me see if I'm a competitor of those, or if I'm a hacker, if I could start to expose some data that might have been introduced into an OpenAI model or some other model that's out there, right? Not making any distinct claims, but those concerns and conversations are happening. And so you've got that concern in terms of maybe instead of using the open and public model, not the public models, whether they're open or not, kind of doesn't matter. But do I want to make a distinct sort of line in the sand? Do we want to have a policy that says we will not interact with them, for example, right? We don't want our teams to necessarily interact with them. So that's a distinct concern. The second concern has everything to do with sort of the problem of hallucinations, or the reality of hallucinations with generative AI and large language models, right? People are starting to come around to the reality that that's kind of how the models work, right? We call it a hallucination. It is, hallucination is sort of a big scary word for that's how large language models work. They take the input that you give it, and they do their best to make a guess of what the answer should be, right? And they've got various mechanisms to figure out how to try and ground that or bound it to some other known source of truth. But in some cases, when you're asking it to create something, to generate generative, it's making its best guess at what the next words should be, what the next paragraph, what the next concept should be. And so, there are a lot of enterprises that are concerned about, well, what's the level of consistency that creates, right? So there's obviously the basic concern of like, this will, create something that's incorrect. And we've seen examples of that. And those examples will continue to pop up. And there's ways, I think, to manipulate them to get them to, say weird things like you should, glue your cheese to your pizza. But, from an enterprise perspective, they are concerned about, they are concerned about the sort of wild things that are wrong, but they're also concerned about the minutia things that might be slightly incorrect. And they realize that, yes, even when we train humans to do certain tasks, they're going to get things wrong, and they're going to get things sometimes wildly incorrect, sometimes partially incorrect. And some of that will depend on how well you train them, how experienced they are, what's the scenario that they're put into. Is it stressful? Is it common everyday types of things? But they don't yet know what that level of accuracy can be. And I don't think they know how to necessarily know how to predict what that accuracy could be. So if you told them today, look, it's going to be 99% accurate, they probably could make some sort of decision as to, how will we use it? How comfortable are we with using it? And then when those problems arise, like, how do we go about fixing them, right? In the same way that if, one of your human workers makes a mistake and somebody takes action based on that, or kind of pulls a Karen and says, hey, can I talk to the manager? I think this is incorrect, or I think the scenario has arisen that we have a problem here, right? Like, I'm getting incorrect information or invalid information. You put things in place that allow you to escalate that to somebody with higher authority, greater knowledge, whatever that might be. But I don't think they know right now, like, is it 99%? Is it 93.6%? Is it 85% in some scenarios and 99.9% in other scenarios? I think that variability is what we're hearing from a lot of enterprises, that they're not exactly sure what to do with these generative AI models. And so what that puts on them is, if they're experimenting out in public, and they're not exactly sure how their data works and what happens when it interacts with these public models, many of them, in conversations that I've had over various types of events and other things, they're looking for ways to experiment, but they're looking for ways to experiment that aren't necessarily in the public eye, or that could be sort of semi-traced through the public markets, right? So, for example, if they wanted to test out a new chatbot, some sort of intelligent assistant, whatever it might be, whatever the use case might be, maybe augmenting an application, they're looking for ways to say, I want to experiment with it. I want to be able to build my own benchmarks. I want to be able to use people within our own company who have expertise on this to give us human feedback, just like sort of the human feedback that we see in other systems. But they're looking for ways to sort of, again, really kind of experiment. And because, again, you don't necessarily know what the baselines of those should be or the best practices should be, the idea of private models, doing things on premises, doing it with your own data, all those things are appealing to companies in terms of saying, look, if I don't know what I'm doing, I don't necessarily want to make mistakes. It's human nature not to want to make mistakes, but I also sort of want to know what's the blast radius of my failure is going to be. And the more I can do that in ways that aren't visible in public, because again, they've watched, even with small anecdotes that are out there. This company built a chat bot and some weird thing happened, and then it ended up in the local newspaper, or it ended up in the Wall Street Journal, or ended up on CNN, or it ended up in some mainstream thing, or it ended up as a thread on Reddit that went on for a week and a half about how this company doesn't know anything, or this company's got bias that are not approved by public. Oh, it came across as racist. It came across as bias against women. It came across as whatever. And again, that in most cases probably wasn't the intent of the company. But again, when you don't exactly know how the large language models work, and you don't necessarily know how to troubleshoot them yet, or you don't know how to tune them properly. And again, all these things are learning curves for people. There's a lot of concern and hesitancy. And again, one of the things that I've heard over and over again is this interest in saying, well, are there ways to mitigate those things? And there are going to be, interest in conversations and experimentation about how to do that at a technology level. So, are there ways to eliminate, quote unquote, eliminate or reduce hallucinations? But there's also going to be ways to do that from a practical level of saying, if our data doesn't mix with these other things, we feel better about that. If we can internally kind of be our own dev and test as opposed to something that gets more exposed in the public domain, that's interesting to us as well. And so I think all of those things sort of lend themselves towards there is going to be, until there is much more visibility, a distinct market for sort of private cloud AI, right? Just like today, even if you, and again, depends on who you listen to, but if you listen to like Amazon, for example, you listen to Adam Selipsky before he, was replaced, he was saying, look, 15% of the applications that are out there for, in the world or for enterprises are in the public cloud. So, we still have massive amounts of information, of applications, of data for enterprises that are in their own private clouds, that are in on-premises environments. And so, when you put together most of their data is on-prem, most of their applications is still on-prem, even though the public cloud has grown quite a bit, it's still, let's put it in the 15 to 20%, second inning sort of, maturity or, kind of volume. It lends itself to, there are so many more opportunities on premises in the private cloud for things like AI. Now, again, it still has to work through some stuff like, can you get GPUs on-prem? Can you manage those very well? Are they things that, because of the cost of GPUs, that people are going to invest in, again, maybe smaller footprints? But those are also the sort of dynamics that, lead to changes in what we know about how something works and new innovation coming along. So this may be opportunities in which we'll see lower cost GPUs because, it's now not just NVIDIA, it's AMD and Intel and maybe something else that comes along. Maybe we see different ways in which we train models in terms of being able to better control things, to have visibility into how they work in terms of, how to determine hallucinations in terms of volume or percentages and all those sorts of things. And some of it is just going to be the natural kind of ebb and flow of certain things, because they're low-hanging fruit, because there's mass adoption, will happen more in consumer because people get sort of an immediate buzz from them. They get an immediate dopamine hit from, oh, okay, cool. I was able to do this thing, like the first time ChatGPT came out, versus what enterprises adopt, which just typically has taken longer. 5 to 7 years is not unusual to see technology sort of filter their way into enterprises. And enterprises looking for more of a short-term and long-term ROI, because again, they've got plenty of other priorities that they're working against. So anyways, it's not a prediction per se of how big the private cloud AI market is, but I think when we step back away from some of the headlines, away from some of the sort of the biggest names and biggest personalities, and look at the realities of enterprises, of corporate businesses, trying to figure out how do we harness the power of this new technology. It's very, very interesting to us, but we also have to balance that against concerns about privacy and concerns about data loss, in terms about reputation of the business and all those types of things. I think they lend themselves to a very distinct possibility that private cloud AI, while it may not get all of the headlines today that we see so much around public cloud, may very well be kind of the first and second wave of how AI gets into the enterprise outside of some of the sort of low-hanging fruit use cases. Again, the software developer assistant, kind of co-pilot types of things, or augment the chatbot that works in my call center, along those sort of things. So anyways, I'll wrap it up with that. Just some thought around kind of a different perspective on how we think about AI and public versus private nature of those things. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Hope everybody's doing well. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the community. And if we can help with anything, show@thecloudcast.net is the email that you can reach us at. You can also reach us on DMs on Instagram and Twitter and all the other places that we publish the show, or on YouTube if you're watching this on YouTube. So with that, we'll wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.